Well, he is a prominent figure in South African politics now, the head of Build One SA, Mmusi Maimane, who's still considering whether or not to attend the Moonshot Pact convention or not. That's the DA's master plan to oust the ANC in 2024. Leader of the DA, John Steenhuisen, says the pact is taking shape with 5 party leaders already agreeing to attend the convention. Maimane joins us now to weigh in on this. Mr. Maimane, thank you firstly for your time. You and Songezo Zibi are both on the fence about this Moonshot Pact. In your case, it's particularly delicate because, of course, you're a former leader of the DA. How are you weighing up the options?
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to fellow South Africans. I think, as I'd responded back to Mr. Steenhuisen, that this is a very crucial election in South Africa. It's an election that will determine whether citizens can find work, electricity, feel safe or not. It is an insufficient condition to simply say we must coalesce so that we can remove the ANC or stop the ANC-EFF coalition. We need to create an alternative plan for the people of South Africa. So my submission to him was, the first thing is, let's discuss the 10-point plan which I sent to him, which speaks to how we fix energy, how we keep people safe, how we educate young people. Secondly, let's invite more people. Let's invite civil society. Let's invite religious leaders of all kinds so that this is a broader consensus of the people of South Africa. Thirdly, let us go into the meeting and the convention as equal partners, not a historic pattern. Just every individual there must have one vote so that we can determine how we charter a future together. And lastly, let's ensure that actually we have shared values amongst the people we want to work with. Because I think, like you, like me, many South Africans are just tired of coalitions of opposition, simply just to remove the ANC. It would be, at the end of the day, tantamount to just changing from black, green and gold to just another whole set of colors. And it's not helpful. We are seeing it in cities. I'm trying to avoid that situation. And I've always called for coalitions. I've always worked with them as I did in 2016. So I really believe the recipe here that is going to rescue the situation is about making sure we have a credible plan.
So really about the meat of the proposal that would be amongst the coalition partners in this Moonshot Pact. I'm interested just in terms of the discussions between you and Mr. Steenhuisen. If you'll forgive the analogy, was it a bit like hearing from an ex who suddenly rings you up and asks if you can go for coffee and maybe, give it another go?
No, I have, in my world and in my life, just maybe as a Christian or whatever, I have no issues with the DA. I've really just realized that we had 2 separate agendas. And perhaps maybe on their part, they want to focus on minority votes, and I'm committed to building one South Africa. That's the contrast. And so it really, as a principle, believes that they, like many others in the country, have a role to play. And so X or no X, to be honest, I think that it's important that I love South Africa more than holding on to old gripes. I think I've seen some of the leadership there sometimes feel like I'm oppositional to them. No, I'm focused on building this country.
And it's the very name of your party, Build One South Africa. In terms of the canvassing and prep work you're doing as BOSA, Build One South Africa, for 2024, how is that going? And in your drive to really garner majority vote, would working with the DA sort of contradict that, which was the basis of your split?
No, I mean, in many ways, going out of here, that's why we've had to weigh up this decision on the basis of a plan that we are discussing with voters. Our modus operandi is, let's talk shared values, let's talk Ubuntu, let's talk about this 10-point plan that I've put together, because that 10-point plan, we've shared it with religious leaders, we've shared it with traditional leaders, we've shared it with civic society. We've gone out everywhere in communities saying, where there are communities and there are candidates, these are the things we want to do in South Africa. A very simple example. For example, here you and I are discussing maybe in some ways Thabo Bester. But how do we make sure the safety of ordinary people, of the 67 South Africans who are murdered every day in this country, how do we decentralize policing, bring it closer to communities? That's what we're talking about. Yeah. So in many ways, we are simply not going to come to a meeting and say we're here to follow a DA agenda. I would never do that, simply because I rejected it in some ways. So I'm saying let's have a radical central view that brings all parties together. And you will recall, even when in 2016 we set up a coalition in Johannesburg, that coalition lasted. Mr. Mashaba resigned for different reasons than a coalition collapsing, or what we are seeing in coalitions today, where there's a revolving door of mayors. So it's important that you stick to your plan, execute against it, and invite the very communities you're working with. So our preparation has been such. We are recruiting candidates everywhere, and I'm grateful for the fact that citizens in this country don't want to be divided on race. They're actually hustling, and they want to build a South Africa that works for all of them.
Since you brought up the example of correctional services and law enforcement in relation to the Thabo Bester story, what is Bosa's position on how to deal with some of the problems that led to his jailbreak and what's followed?
Now, ultimately, the first thing we've got to start with is accountability. I must concede, we have Minister Bheki Cele, who is the worst of ministers, is underperforming in the highest level. He should take full accountability for what happens. How does someone run a criminal syndicate inside prison? If he knew about Mr. Bester's escape, how come he didn't even warn the victims? I find it completely unacceptable that we have a minister upon which crime is worsening every year. The police are demoralized, and ultimately there's no priority around safety. Yet he manages to keep his job, yet he manages to travel around the country with more security than actually is necessary. I really feel, as South Africans, we need to ask better of our leadership and ask for better outcomes. So in this instance, I would genuinely look for a renewed police minister. But furthermore than that, as I've suggested, we need to decentralize policing. Having a national SAPS is simply not helping us. We need police that sits at regional level so that we have intelligence, so that we know these were criminals hiding in plain sight. They were living in our neighborhoods. How
and
come
five-star hotels, in the case of Mr.
And
Bester.
five-star hotels. How come criminal intelligence was incapable of being able to identify that? This tells you that when you have a national SAPS, it's distant from the issues of intelligence that are happening on the ground. You speak to any citizen in this country. You say, where are the criminals here? If you come to townships, people will tell you all the time in all communities that we know where the drugs are being distributed. We know where the criminals are. And the police simply are not on their side. So we've got to bring it down, add private security, increase a volunteer base, and ultimately execute to make sure all citizens are safe. And then in the criminal justice system, we can improve the probability of people actually getting arrested and being convicted. Because as things stand, in the justice ministry, we are discovering more and more that conviction rate, even amongst murder, is sub 20%, which means that the probability of anyone getting away with murder is much higher. So we need to fix that whole thing. And then lastly, I would argue the case, we need to continue to fund and increase funding to the National Prosecuting Authority so that prosecutors are able to get to matters, convict quickly, and ensure that criminals are locked behind bars.
That's interesting. Is dealing with crime in South Africa at the top of the list for Bosa as a kind of election issue ahead of 2024? Because in some ways, I mean, people feel it differently according to how buffered they are, perhaps by financial resources or class, you could say. But crime is quite a universal problem for people. And as you say, there are so many issues around conviction rates and then, in some cases, keeping those who've been mulcted with sentences behind bars to serve their time.
Well, the election next year is going to really, in my view, be about three things: jobs, education, and safety. You're not going to create jobs when people are not safe. You're not going to create jobs when young people are not skilled. The election next year is about jobs. And if you don't keep the lights on, jobs are not being created. So for us, next year's election is about the fact that young citizens are feeling the pinch. You know, when we talk about inflation, we can talk about global issues, we can talk about every other thing. But in truth, when a citizen goes to bed hungry and a young person knows they've got a limited prospect of finding a job, and then they look around them in society and see others living a quality of life that Thabo Bester is being affording, and they themselves can't even get through 7 days with meals every night, you can appreciate that this is indeed a crisis we're facing in South Africa. So for us, we will ensure that this election next year is about a job in every home. At least in every home there must be someone working, and we must work with public, private to make sure that is our North Star, that we'll deliver on, and ensure that all the things that feed into job creation, fixing energy, making sure our ports work well so that our logistics in the country work well, and keeping citizens safe and educating young people feed into ensuring that actually we can put a job in every home.
So from moonshots to North Stars ahead of 2024. Mr. Maimane, I just want to note something and get your response on this. Of course, safety and security did come up in the DA conference. You're not with the DA. I'm not going to ask you to speak to their policy issues, although you've raised the issue of policy in terms of any possibility of joining the Moonshot Pact. But it strikes me that there was a real emphasis in Mr. Steenhuisen's speech on get rid of the ANC and keep the EFF out. That was kind of, in broad strokes, the drive of his message as a re-elected leader. You're talking about issues around jobs, education, safety. Do you think that approach, as crude as it is, has some political credence for this political moment in South Africa?
That's why in my response I said that's an insufficient condition. Let us recognize that even those who were fighting against apartheid knew that removing the National Party was not enough. We needed to show South Africans what South Africa they can live in after. Remember, more than half the voters in this country are ANC voters as for 2019. They themselves are anxious about what life will be like after the ANC. So it's important, if you want to lead society, is to help people know what society they will live in after that. Not simply just saying, no, we are going to remove the ANC, EFF. What does that do? We are seeing it in Johannesburg. We are seeing it in Tshwane. We are seeing it in Ekurhuleni. What has it delivered for the people of the country? Instead, worse, it's got a revolving door of mayors, and ultimately services are not being improved. What I'm calling for is that let's craft an alternative vision for South Africa so that citizens, when they say, I back this coalition or this umbrella or whatever you want to configure it around, because we've been working on coalitions, they must have the confidence to know that their future is secure. It's not just, it's insufficient and wrong to simply just say, no, well, we'll remove the ANC and the EFF. They are not the only enemies we've got in this country. We've got bigger issues. We've got the unemployment, and we've got to deal with even issues of corruption. So if there's corruption across all parties, are you going to say, well, let's just get together with those parties because we are removing the ANC, EFF? We've got to deal with corruption in and of itself.
And I suppose the way in which opposition parties work together in itself is very telling. If it's consultative, if it's sort of challenging and engaged, or if it's dictatorial or perceived as dictatorial, that in itself could be the death knell of what follows if indeed a Moonshot Pact or any other agreement works. Just finally, Mr. Maimane, when will you know, if you have any inkling, where you stand on potentially joining this venture? Have you got a deadline?
We've made our submission. We've put our conditions forward to say those are the only ones. I'll await responses from the DA. But we're not standing still. Like I said, I've been in collaboration even with the Umbrella Coalition, with the multiple parties. We've been dealing with religious communities. So actually, we are already on the move to building one South Africa across all various communities. So I'll await their response to our letter, and then we'll take it forward whether actually they want an alternative vision or they just simply want to focus on removing the NCFF.
Well, you didn't make much of my analogy, but it sounds like that initial opening to potentially have a coffee and see if there's a way to find one another could lead to a new romance between Bosa and the DA. Mr. Maimane, thank you for your time this Sunday afternoon.